Part 1. The Forbidden Love. Episode 1. I never thought I'd believe in the old stories, not until that night. You've probably heard them too, those stories whispered by the firesides. Stories about cursed lovers, spirits that wander the earth, and what happens when sacred traditions are broken. I grew up hearing them from the older villagers. At first, they were just that, stories, fables meant to scare children and keep them in line. But I've learned the hard way that some stories aren't just stories. Some of them are warnings. I thought I understood the world well. I was trained as an anthropologist, a student of history, culture, and belief. I thought that by studying people, I could understand them completely. But that was before I saw what I saw, before I heard the wail that froze the blood in my veins. It started when I traveled to a Maasai village deep in the savannah. I had been to several villages before, but this one felt different from the start. The air was thick with something I couldn't place, something ancient and heavy. Something was wrong there. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was about to witness something that would change everything I thought I knew about the world. The village stood at the edge of the vast savannah, with the sun setting low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the red earth. I arrived on a dusty afternoon, my jeep kicking up the dry earth as I rolled into the village. It wasn't too far from the mountains, and you could smell the wildness in the air, the scent of grass and smoke, and something more, something older. The village wasn't big, but it was more than self-sufficient, built around the traditional Maasai way of life. The circular houses, made of mud and grass, looked sturdy enough to withstand the harsh seasons. As I pulled in, I was greeted by a few villagers who waved me over. I'd been sent by a university to study the Maasai's way of life, their traditions and their culture. It was a fairly standard assignment: observe, take notes, and return with findings. But the moment I set foot in that village, I felt like I had stumbled into a place that didn't belong in the world I knew. One of the first people I met was Olok, a Maasai warrior who stood taller than most of the men I had ever seen. His skin was dark, his face hard and weathered from years spent under the African sun. He wore the traditional red shuka draped over his shoulder, his spears and knife always within arm's reach. There was a quiet authority about him, something that commanded respect. But there was also something unsettling about him, something distant. Olok greeted me with a nod.
"You are welcome,"
he said in slow, measured English.
"We have food and water. Stay with us."
I had no reason to think anything was amiss. I thanked him and followed him to one of the huts where I would stay for the duration of my visit. I'd spent enough time with Maasai communities before to know the customs and etiquette. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the people here weren't as welcoming as I had expected. It was subtle, nothing overt, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching me, sizing me up. That evening, after a simple meal of roasted meat and maize, I sat with some of the villagers around a fire, listening to them talk. Their voices were low and familiar, full of stories that had been passed down for generations. I listened, nodding politely, but my mind kept drifting to Olok and the other warriors who sat nearby, their eyes never straying far from me. As the fire flickered, I noticed something strange. A woman. No, not just a woman, but someone who seemed to stand apart from the others, moved through the village like a shadow. She was tall, with long limbs that gave her an almost otherworldly grace. Her face was beautiful in a way that struck you as unnatural, like she belonged to another world. Her eyes, though, were what caught my attention. They were an eerie green, something I had never seen before among the Maasai people. They seemed to glow in the firelight, unnatural and piercing, and when her gaze met mine, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I looked away quickly, embarrassed by my staring, but it was impossible to forget the way she had looked at me. There was something cold about her gaze, something almost predatory. "Who is she?" I asked one of the younger men sitting next to me. He hesitated before answering.
Her name is Amina. She is a healer.
He said, almost in a whisper.
She lives with the elders.
But his voice trailed off. But what? The young man glanced nervously at the others, then back at me.
They say she is special. Some say she has power. A curse, perhaps.
A curse? I was intrigued, but I didn't press the matter. I had heard rumors before, stories from older villages, but I figured this was just another superstition. It was a small village after all, and people liked to tell stories to pass the time. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about Amina. The next day, I saw her again. She was sitting under a tree, talking to a group of elders. They were all speaking in low, rhythmic tones, and even from a distance, I could see the respect they gave her. There was something unsettling about the way the men looked at her, too. It was a mixture of admiration and fear, as if they knew something I didn't. I couldn't stop myself. I walked closer, pretending to observe the village, but really, I was trying to understand what was going on. As I passed by, I overheard a snippet of their conversation.
"She is the last one,"
one of the elders said.
The curse lives on through her bloodline.
Another elder's voice was quieter, almost a murmur.
"The warrior was wrong. The gods are angry."
The words didn't make sense to me, but they stayed with me, haunting me. It wasn't until later that night, when I couldn't sleep, that I began to understand. I had a strange dream that night. It was vivid, too real, almost like I was seeing something that had already happened. I dreamt of a warrior, tall, strong, dressed in red robes, walking through the savannah with a woman beside him. Her hair was wild, her eyes glowing in the moonlight, and as they walked, the ground beneath their feet seemed to wither, as if their very presence was poisoning the earth. The dream was so real, so intense that I woke in a cold sweat. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The image of the glowing woman stayed with me. The next morning, I went to find Olok. I had to ask him about what I had overheard. When I found him, he was standing by the fire, sharpening a spear. "Olok," I said cautiously, "what is the story behind Amina? Is there a curse on her family?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with those piercing eyes of his, like he was deciding whether or not to speak. Finally, he sighed.
Some stories are better left untold.
He said quietly, his voice low.
But you are here now. I will tell you what I know.
He paused, and I waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say would be something I couldn't forget.